Welcome back to the table. Ryan and I just played Expeditions. This is the sequel to Scythe. It's different in many regards. It's similar in some regards.
It actually walks a pretty fine balance between feeling like Scythe, but also not at all, which I think they made a smart move, not just calling this Scythe 2.
Yes.
It definitely is not Scythe.
Yes, this is another game set in that universe. It actually has some things that will be familiar in terms of these achievements being somewhat of a race game, not as much of a race game, I don't think. But what you're doing in the game is completely different.
Well, yeah, thematically the game is very different. This kind of takes place after the events of Scythe, and there was this meteor crash, and you're just exploring. You're going out and exploring this map, and you see the map we've already played, so we've already fully explored. A lot of these tiles are going to start face down, and you'll see these cards in between. And a lot of these cards are going to be cards that you'll take into your hand, and they do a variety of different things, but you're exploring the tiles for different actions and using the cards for their abilities, which is very different from Scythe already.
Yeah. At the beginning of the game, in fact, just these tiles are revealed, and then these second layers are uncovered or covered, and you have to actually go out there and explore them, flip them over to find out where the different actions are in the game because they are randomly set up that way. But those aren't the only actions you're going to be taking. There's going to be a lot of card play, and this is definitely his favorite part of the game.
For sure.
But it supplements a lot of what you're doing out there on the board because you can make some things happen in your tableau as well as taking some of the actions on the board.
Let's talk about that, right?
Yeah.
Because this game is super easy to teach and super accessible. There's only 3 actions that you're doing in the game, period. 3 actions. You're either moving, you're playing a card from your hand, or you are gathering and using the ability on one of the tiles. That's it. And it seems very simple, but then you start to realize as you're playing that a lot of the interactions you're doing are based on that play action, which is going to let you use these cards to gather resources, take a variety of abilities which involve completing quests, equipping items onto your mech mat, melding these meteorites that you find to you to give yourself special powers. There's a lot of things that you're doing that are specifically tied to just the cards outside of those 3 basic actions.
Yeah, and effectively they also repeat a lot of what's out here, but like Ryan said, they do so much more. But before we get to any details about playing the cards or moving or gathering, we have to talk about how that's done, because you're not just taking one of those 3 actions. On your turn, it's kind of interesting because if at the very beginning of the game, your first turn, you take all 3 of those actions. And in fact, throughout the game, after you refresh, which is an option, your next turn will be taking all 3 of those actions again. But if you haven't refreshed, and starting with your second turn, you're actually taking 2 of those 3. Yeah. And on top of that, it's not just any 2 of those 3, because you're going to move this cube on your player board such that if I move and gather, I've covered up the play space. So on my next turn, unless I refresh, I'm going to move or gather and play, because I have to move that cube to one of the other 3 spots, covering it up. So it effectively makes it so you can't just sit there and play and gather, play and gather, play and gather, or move and play. It makes you think about that, and then ultimately you're going to get to a point where maybe you've done play enough to where a lot of your cards are out of your hand area and into the play area that you'll want to do that refresh, at which point you get all your cards back, all the workers off your cards, and yes, there are workers that go on your cards, and then you start over from the very beginning again.
Yeah, that aspect was the most satisfying element for me.
It's very interesting.
This idea that you start the game with just 2 cards and a mech mat and nothing else. And your mech mat has a special ability, and your cards are unique. You have your leader card, or your character card, and your companion card, and these are the only 2 cards you can play to start with. So a large part of what you're doing early in the game is you're collecting cards from out here. This is effectively a row, even though positioning does matter. You're grabbing these cards and you're grabbing workers. Every card needs a worker to power its action if you want. As you're playing cards, they come over to your row. As you're acquiring cards, they come over to your row. This is effectively a discard pile where cards go as you play them, and you're going to end up with a lot of your cards and a lot of your workers locked up. So early, you might play 2 cards, refresh, you're getting 2 cards back. But then later, you might be getting 5 or 6 cards back. And by the end of the game, you might be playing a ton of cards, a ton of workers, and have a giant pile of stuff. Every time you refresh, you're getting it all back, and that lets you play it again. So these cards are going to be getting played a lot.
Yeah, until a lot of them actually sort of get not culled out of the game, but you're going to, say, complete a mission. And when you do that, it's one of the cards that was in your hand, and now it goes tucked in above your board. Or collect a meteorite. It's going to go tucked in below your board. Or upgrade one of the item cards. It's going to go tucked in on the side of your board. Those cards then give you some effects, like the meteorites are going to give you, kind of fire off and give you a bunch of rewards. The missions are going to do a lot of the same.
Yeah, they give you in-game scoring. But effectively, they give you in-game scoring.
And the items are going to effectively give you ongoing abilities once you've upgraded them. It's a really interesting balance because the number of cards in your deck, or your hand rather, is going to fluctuate quite a bit. And while this is not a deck builder, and I don't even think we'd use the term deck builder.
I'm hesitant to use the term deck builder. It is at its core just a hand management game. You're managing your hand, you're playing cards, but it hits a lot of the same notes of a deck builder.
For sure.
And a lot of the same notes that a tableau builder might hit, because as you're playing these out, each, I don't even want to say round because there's no rounds, but in between your refreshes, as you're adding cards to this tableau over here, your active row, even the cards that you take immediately go to your active row. You can't use them, but then you might play a card that says, use another card that's already in your active row. Or return a card from your active row to your hand. Or gain some of the resources that are printed on those cards. So you're always kind of looking at that tableau. The more cards you have in there, the more of your workers are potentially locked up. But you have a little bit of flexibility to maybe even reuse a lot of those cards or just trigger them in fun ways. And I think finding those fun ways is core to the game because you can chain together some very satisfying turns, really.
Yeah, there are some definite combo situations here. And Ryan mentioned workers. We've mentioned workers a couple times. I think that's a really interesting part of this game, too. At the beginning, you can collect some workers out on some of the tiles. There are cards that'll let you collect some other workers. There are workers of different colors. When you play one of your cards, all those abilities Ryan's been talking about, those are only usable typically if you have the right colored worker to place on that card the moment you place that card. So there's a lot of things that you're juggling here to really make things sing, because if you don't have what you need, you will find yourself at times taking a turn where you're maybe playing a card and you don't have the worker because that's what you have to do, because you don't quite want to refresh just yet because you want to do this thing out here before someone else does it and things like that.
Yeah, I think that push is really like that. Almost, that's not push your luck, but it has that same feeling of like, can I get to this location before I refresh? I'm not going to refresh this turn. Oh, but David just moved to that location. Now I wish I would have refreshed because I can't go do the thing that I wanted to do. Now, do I delay another turn? Like, there's a lot of those decisions you have to make in the game. And it's not a race game, but you are trying to complete objectives. And so a lot of what you're doing in the game, including collecting workers, collecting cards, fighting these corruption, which they're corruption tiles, spread out the meteors that dropped, spread this corruption across the world, and you're trying to fight against that. All of that is going to influence what you do to score points at the end of the game. Your goal is to get all of these stars out. There's only 4, so it's a little different than Scythe. And also, one thing I really liked is that you can't just claim these as soon as you claim them.
Right, that's a big difference.
I think that's a big difference. You have to specifically go to certain locations in order to claim these, or maybe even play cards that might have that ability. And a lot of those abilities that let you claim your stars are covered. Whenever these corruption tokens come out, whenever a new tile is discovered, you can't use some of the actions on the tile until they're cleared out. Of course, that's an action called Vanquish that you have to do by playing cards and spending resources. You have this resource track that moves up and down, really just the 2 resources.
Yeah, it's amazing because as we're sitting here describing this, it is an easy game to get going and playing, but there is so much for us to tell you about the game that we can't even cover everything in this play.
We're not even going to try to.
There's so many things you're doing because of all of these achievements that you're going after. They're based on so many different things, like Ryan said, completing missions, collecting those meteorites. The one thing about vanquishing that corruption out there, that's a fairly significant part of the game. I mean, I think that's going to be something that, I don't know that you play this game and you don't do that.
No, because you want to get access to those actions, and that corruption is going to help you complete some of these achievements, and it's also worth points at the end of the game. If you've managed to fend off some corruption, you get points. Plus, there's some cards that let you, if you're the one to take the last corruption tile off, activate the tile, which is really good as well. So there's a whole timing element there. But the reason I mention this is because my biggest frustration with Scythe, and maybe a lot of people's, is that you can cash in these as soon as you get them. And in Scythe, you could be like very close to completing like 3 or 4 objectives and then do them all in one turn, get like 4 stars out there, trigger the end of the game, and then it's a hard stop.
Yeah, it's the hard stop, I think, is the big stinger on that, because in this one, it is not a hard stop. Once someone places their 4th star, everyone else, everyone, including them, gets another turn. So it doesn't feel as much like it sneaks up on you and like, oh, well, I was about to do a thing.
Right.
You can still do that thing that you were about to do, but you better hope you still got the stars out there and the points values, because you're going to want to complete missions to make those stars worth that many more points. There's a lot more going on there at the end.
There definitely is, but since you have to take actions, really getting even 2 stars in one turn would be half of your stars is very difficult to do. So you can kind of see if people are getting close to completing these, but also are they close to getting to the action spots, which those action spots might be blocked by other players, and you can kind of do that to prolong the game and make it harder for somebody to complete their objectives, which I like that much better. I don't like that Scythe creeps up on you and one player can just drop a bunch of stars. Like, that's always been a deterrent for me to my enjoyment of Scythe.
So let's segue to who we think this is for, who we think it's not for. It's going to cover a lot of some of the things we've already talked about and maybe bring into some of the other things that we haven't touched on yet. I would say who it's for is going to be someone, I'm not sure if this is who it's for, but
I hope it is. I hope so.
Stick with me on this. If you didn't like Scythe, I think there's a lot of reasons to still try this, even though it's the sequel to Scythe. I wouldn't consider myself the biggest Scythe fan.
I'm definitely not.
I don't like the hard stop. I don't like the aggression, even though it's not like a war game. There's certainly
war game elements.
There is more aggression in Scythe than there is in this.
We'll talk about
so I would say if you're someone who particularly thought the universe and the setting was very interesting and cool, but maybe Scythe mechanically and gameplay-wise wasn't your cup of tea, I would absolutely give this a try, because I like this game a lot.
Yeah.
Like, this was a lot of fun after our first play. The flow of what you're doing and the to me, it's got to be the combos. It really makes me feel like it's very satisfying to play.
I'll add on to that by saying Scythe is I mean, it kind of is a war game. It's an area control game. You're trying to control territories. You're trying to control resource production so that you can get the most resources and improve your player board and everything. This is about exploration. And that theme of like getting out there, not just exploring the map, I would even go one step further and say exploring this huge deck of cards, which David and I looked through this whole deck and we saw a small fraction of these cards and they're all unique.
Yeah.
Exploring this game and exploring those combos is a very satisfying feeling. You don't know what you're going to get when you flip a tile. You don't know what you're going to get when you draw cards. You're going to find combos in your 3rd or 4th game that you just never thought about because you're going to see cards in an order that you never had seen before.
Yeah, it's going to feel very different. I know we've only played it once, but I would anticipate, given the fact that these cards come out, who knows what's coming out, you're going to, by necessity, build a different hand of cards when you're playing the second game. So it's going to evolve in a very different way. And speaking of that, I do want to touch on one other thing. If you like games that have some interesting variability, like I think people would find in Scythe, but a little bit more accessibility, because this is definitely a more accessible game. You can set this down in front of someone, and the complexity of this game kind of unfolds as you play it a little bit more. Now, with that said, there are some things you need to know, but if I sit down a casual player in front of Scythe, and even just looking at the player board, those people are like, what?
Yeah.
This, you start with this little mech, but it does have some variable powers. Like mine was, I can move 1 to 4 locations where everyone else can do 3.
Yep.
All of them have different variable powers, not to mention our 2 starting cards, while very similar, have minor little differences that make them feel unique as well.
Yeah, and the fact is, like, you start with just 2 cards and just a few locations. So all you really need to talk about is here's what these locations do, here's what these cards do. As you start to draw more cards, or as you start to take more cards, you start to see more abilities, you start to see more of what the game can do as you start to explore more tiles. So the game really does grow with you. If you're just sitting down, you have this icon sheet, the first time you see an icon, you can pretty quickly reference what it does. I think it really does guide that process. Now, experienced gamers, people that have played this game multiple times, will start to know, okay, I know there's this particular tile that does the thing I want to do, but you still have to go find it.
For sure.
So that's an interesting part of the variability.
I would say if you're teaching someone, and there's some of you that know the game and some of you don't, I would go through a lot of the tiles and show people, here's some things that are coming up. One other thing I want to talk about in terms of who it's for is if you like games that build, this game builds. This game starts out, like we said, pretty slow at first. You're doing this and that. The turns go really fast, but what you're having happen for you in your game is minimal compared to what it's like later in the game. Later in the game, you're making massive things potentially happen. And one cool thing about all the cards as you play them, they're going to give you a couple of those resources. Throughout the game, as you get more stars out there, all your cards are just more powerful.
Well, not all of them.
Not all of them,
but a lot of them
but many of the cards benefit from having stars out or having basically progressed in a number of different ways in the game, so that later in the game, you're just taking bigger turns.
Sure.
And the game accelerates very much at the end to where like you could be going for a while, and then before you know it, oh, okay, some stars are going out.
So yeah, I think you could tell we really enjoyed our first play, and we think that this is for a lot of people, but there's still an audience I think this game is not for. If you liked Scythe, if the draw of Scythe for you was the PvP, the area control, the combat, there is none of that. There is no direct player versus player interaction in this game whatsoever. You cannot hurt other players. You cannot steal from other players. You cannot knock them out.
know. We haven't gone through that whole deck.
No,
but I doubt there is.
There's nothing that's going to negatively impact. Everything is just your own little engine you're building. However, I mean, that being said, there is still that blocking aspect, or like I'm not, if you have a quest that requires you to go to the location, I can try to sit there as long as possible and kind of mess up your game.
The tension comes from a lot of that, not only just the blocking, but like you said, there's opportunistic things out here where there's these 5 cards come out and you're like, okay, I want to get that card before
that card
someone
is perfect for my engine.
I don't want anyone else to get that card. So there is a lot of that going on. Obviously, the tension involved with getting these stars out. Now, it must be everyone, just like Scythe, you can get stars out, just one per achievements, but all the players can achieve the thing. So no one's beating anyone to those. But there is definitely an amount of tension there. But I would agree.
There's still tension.
If you just like the combativeness and the area control type aspects of Scythe, it doesn't really have that.
And that's why I think I'm glad that they didn't just call this Scythe 2, because the area control aspect of Scythe is huge. Also, and this just seems strange to say, Scythe is a little bit more narrative, and like you get those cards, event cards every round or whatever that have you make decisions and read narrative. That's also missing here. However,
well, the quests are a little like that.
Right. The game still feels very thematic.
Yeah.
And that narrative comes through in a different way. It's more like you have one mech, you're moving around this thing, that's all you've got. And you're uncovering these quests, you're meeting new characters, you're doing things, everything has a thematic title, and it just kind of lends to the feeling of like building your own personal story. So it is very different style of narrative than what you'd find in Scythe as well.
Yeah, it is a different type of narrative. I also think that is the one thing that will draw the people who liked Scythe, for whatever reason you liked Scythe. It's worth giving this a try, even though it does have different mechanics. Because I think if you really enjoy that universe, I think you'll enjoy this. It still has a lot of that tension, even though it's just a different game. It just happens to be different in the ways I think we like.
Right.
For sure.
This for me, because I loved the world of Scythe. I've been familiar with the artist for years. Just Jamie took a lot of inspiration from seeing his artwork, and I love that they had so many new unique pieces of that artwork here on the tiles, on the cards. It's all different, and it's all just gorgeous art style. So if you've always wanted to play in the world of Scythe but don't like that PvP, don't like to feel that kind of area control conflict, this is a perfect game for that.
Yeah, I would definitely seek this out and give it a try. And we have to say one more time, it is absolutely beautiful. Not only the art, but the whole production, just like most of the Stonemaier games.
Production.
And in fact, we have the Ironclad Edition. This was provided to us by Stonemaier Games. Wanted to say that for full transparency.
Well, yeah. Stonemaier always puts a lot of work into the way their games look. I mean, one of the big reasons Scythe originally got so much attention was just the look. I mean, it was a Kickstarter game. Nobody had played it, but it looked incredible. And then it turned out also to be a game that lots of people love.
Yeah, so we'll try to get this game maybe played on the channel so you can see it in action. Because I know that we kind of glossed over a lot of what's going on in this thing. But if you have any questions, nonetheless, get down there in the comments and let us know. We'll get down there and try to answer whatever we can. Until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.